Most people think they know where Chucky came from. A red-haired doll with a knife, a serial killer trapped inside plastic, a horror movie villain designed purely to scare audiences. But what if the story behind Chucky didn't actually start in Hollywood at all? What if the idea of a child's toy becoming something deeply unsettling was inspired by something far more real and far more disturbing than the movies ever showed? Because long before Chucky appeared on movie screens in the late 1980s, there were already stories circulating about dolls that seemed to hold something darker. Stories investigators tried to explain. Stories parents quietly removed from their homes. Stories that didn't involve curses or magic, but something far more uncomfortable: human behavior. When the movie Child's Play was released in 1988, audiences were introduced to Chucky, a seemingly innocent good guy doll that becomes the host for a murderer named Charles Lee Ray. It quickly became one of the most recognizable horror villains ever created. The character was shocking because it twisted something safe and familiar into something threatening. Toys were supposed to comfort children, not stalk them. But the real reason Chucky unsettled people so deeply wasn't just the violence. It was the feeling that something about the concept felt strangely believable. Children form attachments to objects, dolls, stuffed animals, figures they talk to when no one else is around. For decades, psychologists have studied how kids project personalities onto toys. Tame. They give them thoughts. They imagine conversations. And sometimes, those imagined personalities start to feel a little too real. If you enjoy real-life horror, deep dives like this, make sure you will resubscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because the deeper you look into the real inspirations behind Chucky, the stranger the story becomes. When people try to trace the origins of the killer doll idea, one name always comes up. Not a movie character. A real doll. One that still exists today. Robert the doll sits inside a glass display case in a museum in Key West, Florida. He's small, worn out, dressed in a faded sailor suit. At first glance, he looks like any other antique toy from the early 1900s. But the story surrounding him is the reason so many people connect him to. The idea behind Chucky. Robert originally belonged to a boy named Robert Eugene Otto in the early 1900s. According to family accounts, the doll was given to him as a gift. Almost immediately, something about the boy's relationship with the toy began to worry his parents. They said Eugene would talk to Robert for hours. That part wasn't unusual. Children often talk to toys, but what disturbed them was that sometimes they said the doll seemed to answer. Neighbors claimed they would hear two voices coming from the boy's room. Eugene's voice, and another one that sounded different, lower, angrier. Whenever his parents asked who he was talking to, the boy would simply say, "Robert." The strange part was that the doll and the child shared the same name. Soon the household began noticing things moving around the house. Toys appearing in different rooms, furniture shifting slightly when no one admitted to touching it, and whenever Eugene was confronted about it, he blamed the doll Robert d'Italiano. For years, the story became part of local folklore. Some people believed the child was simply imagining things. Others suspected deeper psychological issues. But the family insisted something about the doll made them uncomfortable. Servants reportedly refused to enter the boy's room. And according to several accounts, the doll would sometimes appear in different parts of the house when no one remembered moving it. Now, there's no confirmed evidence that anything supernatural ever happened. Historians believe many of the stories were exaggerated over time, but the psychological aspect is what really caught the attention of horror writers decades later. A child projecting personality, anger, even blame, onto a toy. It created a disturbing possibility. What if a toy didn't need to be possessed by a killer spirit to become frightening? What if the danger came from the human mind instead? When the creators of Chucky began developing the character, they wanted to tap into something that felt familiar yet wrong. Something that would immediately trigger unease. A toy that seemed to have intentions. And while the movies leaned heavily into supernatural explanations, the real world has always offered a different possibility, one that might be even more disturbing. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, several psychologists documented cases where children formed extremely intense emotional attachments to dolls or figures. These weren't simple imaginary friends. In some cases, the children described the toys as having opinions, anger, even control. One study from child behavioral specialists described a case involving a boy who insisted his doll told him to break objects in the house. When asked why he did it, the boy calmly said the doll would get upset if he didn't listen. Another case involved a girl who claimed her doll became mean at night. She would place the toy facing the wall before going to sleep because she said she didn't want it watching her. Now, from a scientific perspective, these behaviors are often linked to developing imagination and emotional processing. Children externalize their feelings. Fear, frustration, anger, all of it can be projected onto objects. But for parents witnessing it in real time, the experience can feel deeply unsettling. Imagine walking past your child's bedroom and hearing them whispering to a toy in the dark. Then hearing them suddenly stop, as if something answered. This psychological tension is exactly what made the concept behind Chucky so powerful. The idea that something innocent could become a vessel for darker thoughts. And while the movies portray a serial killer controlling the doll, the original inspiration might have been rooted in something far more realistic. A child blaming their actions on something that can't defend itself. In fact, some criminologists have pointed out a chilling pattern in certain early behavioral warning signs among troubled children. They sometimes create imaginary figures that justify harmful actions. It's a way to remove responsibility. It wasn't me. It was him. In the context of a toy, the effect becomes even stranger. Because the object is physically present. You can see it. You can hold it. You can look directly into its face. This is where the line between imagination and unease starts to blur. And if you grew up watching horror movies in the 90s, there's a good chance Chucky changed the way you looked at toys forever. If someone you know remembers those movies too, send this video to them. They might start seeing those childhood dolls a little differently tonight. What most people don't realize is that the creators of Chucky were also influenced by a very real consumer panic during the 1980s. It involved toys that children became obsessively attached to. During that time, products like Cabbage Patch Kids and talking dolls became wildly popular. Parents waited in long lines to buy them. Kids treated them almost like living companions. Some children reportedly cried when separated from them. Others insisted the dolls needed to be placed in certain positions when sleeping. Again, none of this was supernatural. But culturally, people began noticing how powerful emotional bonds between children and toys could become. The idea of turning that bond into something threatening suddenly felt like the perfect horror concept. But there was another layer to the Chucky story that most audiences never considered. The psychology of projection. When people watch horror movies, they often focus on the monster, but the real fear usually comes from something deeper. Something human. Chucky works as a character because he behaves like a twisted reflection of human personality, jealousy, rage, manipulation, control. The doll itself isn't what scares people. It's the idea that a harmless object could somehow become the stage for those emotions. Psychologists call this object personification. We naturally give human qualities to non-human things. Cars have personalities. Pets understand us. And toys sometimes feel like they're watching. Even adults experience this effect. Many people admit they feel uncomfortable when a doll's eyes seem to follow them across a room, not because they believe it's alive, but because the human brain is wired to detect faces and intentions, which leads to an unsettling question. If a child believes a toy is capable of thoughts, could that belief influence their behavior? Some researchers think so. Before we continue, remember where we left off. We were talking about how the idea behind Chucky may have been less about a supernatural doll and more about the human mind projecting darker thoughts onto something that can't defend itself. That psychological pattern shows up in more real-life cases than most people realize. And once you start noticing it, the entire story behind killer dolls begins to look very different. There have been cases where children refused to misbehave in front of certain toys because they believed the toy would report them. Others blamed toys for things they secretly wanted to do themselves. And this is where the Chucky concept becomes strangely symbolic. A toy acting out violent impulses that someone else refuses to admit. In other words, the doll becomes the scapegoat. As disturbing as that sounds, it reflects a very real psychological defense mechanism. When people struggle to confront their own darker emotions, they sometimes externalize them. They create a separate identity, an other. For children, that other might be a doll sitting on a shelf. As the Chucky franchise grew, the films became more exaggerated, more comedic, more supernatural. But the core idea that started it all remains surprisingly grounded in human behavior. Fear of innocence being distorted, fear of losing control of something we once trusted, and fear that the things surrounding us might reflect parts of ourselves we don't fully understand. But there's one final detail that keeps the discussion about Chucky's inspiration alive. Even today, people visiting the museum where Robert the doll is displayed report something strange. Before taking a photo of the doll, visitors are asked to politely request permission. If they don't, museum staff say they sometimes receive emails later from visitors claiming their photos turned out distorted, or that they experienced bad luck afterward. Of course, there's no evidence Robert causes any of this. Most likely, it's just part of the legend. But the fact that adults still feel the need to ask permission from a doll says something interesting about human psychology. Even when we know something isn't alive, part of our brain still reacts as if it might be. And that lingering feeling might explain why Chucky continues to unsettle audiences decades later. Not because we believe a killer spirit could live inside a toy, but because we understand something about ourselves. The mind has an incredible ability to project thoughts, fears, and blame onto objects, sometimes without us even realizing it. And if you think about it long enough, the real question behind Chucky becomes a little uncomfortable. What if the doll was never the frightening part of the story? What if the real fear was always the person standing next to it? I'm curious what you think about this. Do you believe characters like Chucky were purely invented for entertainment? Or do you think horror writers were quietly drawing from real psychological cases people rarely talk about? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.